Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing thesis statements. You can take a look at the handout while everybody's coming in. Any questions before we get started? All right. One of the most important things about a piece of writing is that you have a point to it. Otherwise, we don't want to read it if you really don't have any message or meaning that we can extract the value out of. And sometimes it's not always clear unless you have a clear statement of what that is. And especially it's important for academic writing. Most professors like your thesis statement to be at the end of your first paragraph or the first sentence of your second paragraph. So in that layer between your first and second paragraph, okay? Depending on the length of your paper, a thesis statement is generally 1 to 3 sentences long. It basically sums up the main point you want to make with that piece of writing. It's a strong point. It's not just an observation like it's snowing. There's really not much, you can write about the fact that it's snowing. I mean, if you want to make a point about the fact it's snowing more this year than it did last year and get into a discussion of climate change, but make sure that your thesis is not just an observation, that it has a point that, somebody might argue with out there. And it's not a question. A lot of times, questions are a good way to introduce a piece of writing, but you have to answer the question so we know what the main thing you want to say is. So if you're tempted to use a question as your thesis statement, just answer the question and you should be good. Okay. Not too broad or specific. Now this is trickier. A thesis for a short paper is going to be much different than one for a 50-page thesis or something that's longer. Like I always say, please be more specific rather than less, and write lots and lots on one specific idea. And then if you don't have enough, you can always expand. Whereas if you start too large with your thesis, like climate change, you cannot do a 10-page paper on climate change. There's many books on specific aspects of climate change. You would have to narrow that down to a specific chapter or even a news topic article that talks about one aspect of that. And then once you've given us all the examples and explanations and descriptions you can, and if you don't have the length that you need to meet the assignment or to meet the needs of the information, then you can always expand on it. But if you start really big and you've written a little about this and a little about that and a little about that, you have to toss a lot of what you wrote in order to be more specific. So it'll save you some work in the long run if you start specific. Longer pieces of writing can also benefit from most pieces of writing can benefit from an essay map. An essay map is a thesis statement that points out the main points that you will cover in your essay. So it basically For some reason, human beings like things in 3. We consider 2 to be not enough. I mean, 4, you could do 4 too, but at least 3 things that support your main point. So you can say something like, scuba diving is relaxing, challenging, and good for the environment. I am totally making that up. I don't know that it's good for the environment. It might be bad for the environment. But what you see is that I have outlined the 3 aspects or the 3 supporting points that I'm going to cover in the paper. And then your reader is going to expect that you cover them in this order. That you talk about first how it's relaxing, then it's challenging, and the last part if it's good or bad for the environment. Okay? So that's what I mean by an essay map. This gives you and your reader an idea of what you're going to discuss, and it gives them, you know, sort of confidence that there's valuable information in there. So let's talk about identifying thesis statements. It's sometimes you don't know what your thesis is. There's a writer who used to say, I don't know what I think until I see what I say. So sometimes it takes your shitty first draft to give you an idea of what it is you're trying to get at or the point that might be in your piece of writing. So because this is a personal essay you're doing for the next assignment, for Monday, your shitty first draft, it may wander. That's okay. Usually the essay map, good question, is within the thesis statement. Okay. So you could have actually a 2-part thesis statement, like you can have it all together, like I have it down here at the bottom. So you could have scuba diving is an excellent hobby. And then you'd have 2 sentences. So you could do it in 1 sentence like I did it, or you could have your main point and all the supporting points come after it. So it's basically what you feel works best for your paper, whether you want to put it in 1 sentence. Many longer papers can have 2 to 3 sentences. 2 tends to be the, you know, maximum for most of them. But yeah, you can do it this way, or you can incorporate it all into the same statement. Okay. All right. Good question. Anybody else? Like I said, don't sweat it too much if you're not sure after your shitty, you know, before your shitty first draft, what your main point is. So let's practice looking at the main points. How do you figure out what your main point is? So in Adisha's TED Talk, right, what do you think her main point was? In your own words. Tell me what her main point for the talk was. So I'd like everybody to put what you think the thesis is, and then we'll discuss the different impressions that you have of it. What do you think the main thing she's trying to say? So her topic is the danger of a single story. That's one place you can start when you're looking for the thesis or something. What's the topic? Now, what was her main point about the danger of a single story? Very good. Yes. There's always more than one story. That's part of it. And what is the problem if you're only exposed to a single story? So she goes, first she says, there's only one more story, but she goes a little bit next beyond that to say, what's the problem with only having a single story? Yes. So when you put those 2 things together, you get a really strong thesis statement. Based on her observations, that's how she shows us how she reached that conclusion, right? So very good. You guys, Lily and Annalea put it together. Basically, there's always more than one story. And if you only rely on one story, you get, you can get a false perception of a group or a people or a country. Okay? And then you're working with bad information or incomplete information, right? Um, and now, how did she show us that? Through her experiences, what taught her that there isn't just a single story and that not knowing all the stories can be a problem? What examples did she use? So she showed us, she didn't say, hey, many people only have one story of a people or culture, so it's dangerous. And we would have been like, okay, something to think about. But she went beyond that to really show us. What's one example that she used? Claire, what do you think?
Can you repeat the question, please?
What examples did she use to show that there's a danger to having a single story about something?
Oh, probably since there's only a single story, it's like a label, if you know what I'm trying to say. It's like a label on her when really you're just assuming who that person is and not knowing the whole story.
Yeah, what was the single story her roommate had of her when she moved to college?
I'm not sure.
Anybody help her out? Her roommate had certain ideas about her before she even met her. What were those ideas? Devin, what do you think? What were the ideas her college roommate had before she even arrived? Thanks, Lily. Africans are poor and not exposed to the same music and technology. She asked to hear her tribal music. So that was a good specific example that showed us. She didn't just say, my roommate, pitied me even before she met me. She said she wanted to hear my tribal music and was surprised when she, produced Mariah Carey because she had a perception of the kind of music that she would listen to, right? She was surprised that she knew how to work a stove. So she had a single story of Africa being primitive and uneducated and not exposed to the music of the world, right? And she told that story and gave us descriptions and examples to show us so that we could get a deeper understanding of how she reached her conclusion, right? Good. What other examples did she use where she realized that maybe her perception of someone was incomplete? Camilla, what do you think? Yeah, Devin, that's a good way to put it. Um, is that we only see the surface of something instead of the deeper complexities of a people or a place. Yeah. Yeah, Annalie, that's a good example. When she says she had one idea of what immigrants were from, and Mexican immigrants had become synonymous with immigration. When truth is, right, there's a lot of other countries that people immigrate from. So she uses her own sort of misperception of what it was. And then she went to Mexico, and then she saw there are huge cities. Mexico City is a huge city with, you know, that's just like a city anywhere else with people working, and, you know, they don't want to leave. They're in their own country. They have their own lives. You know, Mexican people are not just the immigrants crossing the border, and even the immigrants crossing the border. Go ahead. Thought someone had something to add. Yeah. Now she starts talking chronologically. We're going to talk a little about organization too. So she's talking about, first she started talking about, right, what was the first example she gave of her encounter with a single story? What was the first example? From when she was a child. Milos, do you remember?
Maybe she was poor.
A little bit louder.
Maybe that she was poor. She said something about one poor family. I don't know.
She had the experience with what she calls their houseboy Fide, right? So her idea of Fide's family, of a poor family, was just somebody that you should pity, right? And then she got to know them better and realized they were very hardworking. They produced beautiful baskets and art, and there's more to them than just this single story of their poverty, right? So that's one example. And even before that, she talked about the books that she read, right? All the books that she read showed her that books had to be a certain way. What were the characters like in the books that she read as a child? Isabella, do you remember? Somebody want to help her out? What were those characters like in her children's books? Remember what you said about ginger beer? Now I want to hear the story.
She said that she cannot like try it in Nigeria because they don't have it.
Right. She reads a story about and thinks that the main characters have to be white. They have to eat apples, right? They have to talk a lot about how bad the weather is when, you know, the weather was generally not a problem where she was at. They didn't have ginger beer. Okay. In her country, they ate mangoes instead of apples. So she had a single story of what, you know, basically a book was, a children's book was. And then she said she started being exposed to African authors and learning, you know, there wasn't just a single story of what a book could be. So she has lots of great examples in that talk that go beyond telling us to really showing us to add more depth and understanding to what she's trying to say. Okay. So let's see. Yeah, and then she talked about other stories of her own country, of people, you know, the heart procedure that they had pioneered in Nigeria, and people she knew, like her friend, who were doing it. Now, she still acknowledges that there are failings with her country. She doesn't, you know, try to say that parts of the story aren't unfortunate, right? It's just that it's a more complex picture than if you only get one sort of, you know, sound bite over and over again. So that's the way that you can build your essay, you know, is focus on a time in your life when you encountered reading or writing or music, song lyrics, you know, and give us specific examples that give us a more in-depth understanding and show us what it meant to you or what message it gave you. So let's talk about the Malcolm X essay. Start talking about that one. There's also a quiz due on this one for next week. Let me share my screen here. So to access the quiz, you can either click on it here, or you can go up to quizzes at the top. You guys have done the syllabus quiz before, right? So if we look at the essay, so who is Malcolm X? You do the pre-reading. The essay is called Coming to an Awareness of Language, right? So remember, it helps to get an idea of who someone is to shed more light on their experience, right? He was born in Nebraska. He was the son of a minister. He lived in a time period where the civil rights movement was going on in the United States to change the laws that discriminated against African Americans in the country. He became a leader. He was a follower of Islam and a specific prophet. Okay. Well, when he starts his essay, where's he at? Tristan, do you know where he is when he's writing, or when he's first writing about what happened?
Do I what now?
Where is he right at the beginning of the story?
Is he in Harlem or something?
He's actually in prison.
Oh, okay. Yeah, same thing.
Ow, no, I don't know. I hear Harlem is a pretty cool place. They had the Black Renaissance. They had lots of artists and poets. Don't have a single story of Harlem. But yeah, he talks about being stuck in prison, right? He had a lot of time on his hands. So what did he do?
He started to learn how to read and write or something.
Yeah, because he had things he wanted to really say and communicate to people. And so he tried using sort of what he felt like were his limited language abilities at the time. He wrote to people he knew. He's like, I can talk a good game if I can get somebody in front of me. But he couldn't talk to them because he was in prison. He had to write. So, you know, and then he never got any replies from anyone. He said he wrote to his friends, right? He wrote to lots of people, wrote in care of the bars he knew they'd be at in Harlem. But he felt like he didn't get any response. You know, he's like, look, I knew how I sounded writing in slang. Look, Daddy, let me pull your coat about a cat, Elijah Muhammad. Now, you know, this is back in like a much earlier time period, right? When did he live? 1925 to 1965. So we're probably talking about 45 around that time. He's like maybe 20s. He's pretty young. 45 early going into the 50s. He has these ideas and he knows that the language that he has is inadequate to really persuade people. Persuasion is very powerful superpower of writing and speaking. So he felt like, you know, he could use sort of his charm if he had them in front of him, but if he had to write, you know. So how did he teach himself to write and read better? Devin, do you know how he did that?
Wasn't it because he was like doing those things, like learning how to read and learning how to write?
Yeah, how did he decide to go about learning how to do that? He's in prison. What does he have access to?
Books.
Yeah, books, especially like the encyclopedia, right? Annalee has it. Yeah, he used a dictionary. He copied it, actually. If you guys may not have as much experience with older dictionaries. Older dictionaries can be like this thick. You can kill small animals with them if you throw them at them. I mean, they're really big, heavy things because they don't just have definition of word. They're kind of like mini encyclopedias, as he points out. Like it'll have the word, maybe the first time it was used in history, how it's changed over time. So it's like a little sort of primer on that topic. So not only did he learn new words, but he learned more depth about the words and about the history of the words. Okay. So yeah, he copied the dictionary over and over, and then he read books, right? He read as much as he could get his hands on. So that he could express his ideas in ways that would make people hear him, because he had important things to say about race and about how people should change the status quo. Okay, so he says I copied the dictionary. Like he just started at the beginning. Okay, and as he said, it was inevitable. My word base broadened. So you have his story where he doesn't just say, "Hey, I learned to read from the dictionary," right? He says, you know, he describes. So remember when I talked about when you want to flesh out your essay, right? You add descriptions, like examples and explanations. So explanation, I was so fascinated, I copied the dictionary's next page because he had a dictionary that had pictures and extensive explanations of what each word meant. He started with aardvark, AA, first thing in the dictionary alphabetically. And then he talks about what that looked like. You know, he filled up tablets. Okay. Then he went to the bees. You know, his handwriting improved. And he basically describing and explaining the process. During the rest of the time in prison, I'd say I wrote 1 million words. Okay. So a new world opened to him, right? He was able, I mean, books are a great way to have more than one story. You read about various places and people and ideas. So he read about Elijah Muhammad and his ideas about society, and just the people he wanted to communicate with. So we have this essay, right, where he's talking about being in prison and having an important message and deciding to learn how to express it more clearly in writing, because that was the only outlet that he had at the time. Writing to important people, right? He says he wrote to politicians, right? He wrote to Truman, the mayor of Boston, governor of Massachusetts, people that he thought could affect change, right? But he had to know what he was saying. And so he basically essentially taught him, and then we can see from the essay, he did a really good job, right? He's got an interesting story about his experience learning to read. Okay. So what do you think his thesis is, right? Coming back around to his main point, I had something important to say. I couldn't say it. I learned to read and write more clearly. And what did that do for him? What point does he want to make about this whole process that he went through learning to read and write?
He wants you to know that it wasn't easy and that like he was self-disciplined about it.
Yeah, he does a really good job showing his struggle, right? And you feel sort of the struggle, but then you also feel the victory, right? So I talked about thesis statements being up at the beginning, right? So let's see if we're gonna look there. Some essays, and I'll give you permission for this one too. Sometimes you tell your story and then you make your point about it. So for informal writing, your thesis statement can also be at the end. So where in this essay do you think his thesis statement is? Where does he sum up what he wants to say about this experience and what it did for him? Is it in the beginning here? Or is it at the end? Beginning, he's just pretty much talking about who he wrote to, how he never got any answers, right? So it's not really showing up at the beginning. So let's look at the end. Read this last paragraph and see if you can pick out what you think his main point is. When you find it, type it in the comments. Yes, very good. You guys are good at tag teaming this. You got basically both things, Lily and Mallory. Well done. Basically, reading and writing effectively opened up a whole new world to them that made him feel freer than he'd ever felt in his life, right? In fact, up to then, I had never felt so truly free, right? So reading and writing effectively freed him, you know, to escape to other worlds while he was in prison, he showed us, and to clearly communicate his ideas and fulfill that need he had to express important ideas and try to affect change, important changes. Yeah, it opened up a whole new world that freed him. Being able to, like, one of my favorite quotes is by Mark Twain. It says, "The man who does not read good books has no advantage over the man who can't." You know, if you don't read good books and thoughtful pieces of information, you might as well be illiterate, right? If you're not using that skill to gain more information and knowledge, you have no advantage over somebody who can't even read at all. So this is the kind of thing that, you know, another example, like we saw one where she was speaking. You can also go look on the TED Talk website. They have a transcript of her, so you can kind of get an idea of how she tells it without, if you don't want to watch the whole thing again. The Danger of a Single Story, you can see the whole transcript and how she organizes her story. He organizes his, starting with him in prison, right? And then goes through the process, so step by step, how he learned to read and write more clearly, and then the end result, which it gave him a freedom he'd never had before, even while he was in prison. He felt more free in prison than he'd felt his whole life. Okay, see, hopefully you're getting the idea about, you know, summing up in a main point what you want to say. Like if you talk about songs, then have a main point eventually about what song lyrics do for you, help you, you know, or if you went through the process of having speech therapy, what did you learn about yourself and the world? So there's lots of potential. And like I said, don't worry about if like you're writing the shitty first draft for Monday. If you may not be quite sure what your thesis is, that's okay. You know, after the shitty first draft, we can give you some feedback on what we think the main thing you're talking about is coming across. All right, we're down to the last couple minutes before I open up the question session after class. So we're gonna keep talking about telling stories and some of the things they talk about in your book chapter. And we're also gonna start talking about introductions and conclusions, how to get people's attention, right? Because if you don't get their attention in that first paragraph, the chances they keep reading are lower, and then you might as well not have written it all if they're not going to read what you have to say. Okay, so tomorrow, introductions and conclusions. Otherwise, if you have questions, I'm going to open up a new session for 10 minutes. Let me know if I can help you out with anything. Otherwise, I'll see you guys tomorrow.